At 29 years old, Harriet Vale was told she had 6 days to disappear. Not to move, not to settle her affairs. Disappear. The Pine Cleft Mining Company had already taken her husband, Thomas, in a cave-in below the East Drift. Now it wanted the little plank house he had died paying rent on. Harriet had $9.60, one brindle sheepdog named Brisk, and a winter coming down from the Bitterroot Mountains with iron in its teeth. But what the company did not know was this. Thomas had left her something no ledger could seize. Not money, not a pension, a fact about the earth. And when Brisk began clawing at one frozen hillside every morning, as if the ground itself were trying to breathe, Harriet finally understood what her husband had been trying to teach her. The men in town thought she was digging her own grave. Instead, she was building a house the winter could not enter. The town of Pine Cleft sat in a narrow Montana gulch in the autumn of 1891, a row of raw board houses nailed to the slope beneath the black mouth of the company mine. The place had no softness in it. The store, the bunkhouse, the assay shed, the manager's office, even the little church looked temporary, as if every building knew the ore might fail before spring. By late October, the aspens had gone bare. Frost stayed in the wagon ruts until noon. Smoke from the cabins did not rise straight up anymore. It dragged sideways through the gulch, torn by wind before it could become a cloud. House number 4 stood near the lower road. It had 2 windows, a leaning porch, and a roof patched with tin from blasting powder crates. Thomas Vale had mended every board of it with his own hands, though the company never let him call it his. On the morning Ephraim Klein came to take it back, Harriet was outside cutting kindling. She was small, square-shouldered, and quiet in the way of people who have learned that panic wastes heat. Her brown wool coat was shiny at the elbows. Her boots were cracked. Her hair was pinned beneath a black scarf that had once been proper mourning and was now simply practical. Brisk sat beside the woodpile with his head raised, watching the road. Klein arrived on a gray horse and dismounted without greeting her. He was the company's district agent, a clean-handed man with a red face and a leather account book that seemed to weigh more than any tool in the camp. His hat was brushed. His gloves were new. Nothing about him had ever been trapped under fallen rock. "Mrs. Vale," he said, "your occupancy period expires on the 10th of November. Harriet lowered the axe. Klein stepped onto the porch as if entering his own property, because in his mind he was. Inside, he opened his account book on Thomas's table and pointed to the line that mattered. "Company housing is reserved for active men. Your husband is no longer active." There it was. No longer active, not dead, not crushed, not buried under 12 feet of broken shale with 3 other men while Harriet stood at the mine gate and listened to the rescue picks slow down. Just no longer active. "The replacement timberman arrives next week," Klein continued. "This house will be required." Harriet looked past him to the shelf Thomas had built above the stove. His tin cup still sat there. "And my things?" "The company store account remains unsettled. Furnishings may be held against the balance." The room went very still. The quilt she had stitched. The stove Thomas had hauled from an abandoned cabin. The table he had planed from mine scrap. In Klein's voice, all of it became inventory. Harriet asked one question. "Where would you have me go?" Klein shut the book. "That is not a company matter." Outside, Brisk gave one low growl. Klein glanced at the dog, then at Harriet. "The first heavy snow will make this decision for you. Be gone by the 10th. He left her with the door open and the cold pouring in. For 2 days, Pine Cleft watched her fail to leave. No one said it openly, not at first. The wives who had brought bread after the cave-ins stopped coming by. The storekeeper refused her flour. Men who had worked beside Thomas looked down when they passed her yard. They were not monsters. They were indebted. Every family in Pine Cleft lived inside the company book. A sack of beans, a roof nail, a doctor visit, a pair of boots for a child. All of it appeared in ink before it existed in the hand. No one wanted Klein's attention on their own page, so they called Harriet stubborn because calling her wrong made them feel safer. Then Brisk began his morning ritual. At first light, he would leave the porch and trot up the gulch toward a brown shoulder of hill above the old mule trail. It was not a pretty place. Nothing grew there but bitterbrush, dwarf pine, and a scatter of broken rock. The miners called it Cold Shoulder because the sun slid off it by mid-morning, and the snow never melted there until May. But every morning Brisk went to the same patch of frozen scree, and every morning he dug. Not like a dog chasing a burrow. There was no play in it, no sudden pounce, no barking. He clawed, stopped, pressed his nose to the ground, then clawed again, desperate and certain, as if something beneath the hill was answering him. The first time Harriet dragged him away. The second time she scolded him. By the fourth morning, she followed him with Thomas's old lantern in one hand and a pick in the other. Because she had begun to remember. Not a treasure map, not a secret claim. A supper table sentence from a man too tired to know he was saving her life. Thomas used to come home with mine dust in the creases of his eyelids and a cough he tried to hide. Some nights he said nothing until the stew was gone. Other nights, if the shift had been long enough to loosen his tongue, he talked about the underworld. He was a timberman. He knew which beams would sing before they broke. He knew the sound of wet rock. He knew where air soured and where it moved clean. One February night, when Harriet had wrapped quilts around the cabin door and still could not keep the frost from silvering the inside walls, Thomas had warmed his hands around a cup of coffee and smiled. "Up here, winter owns everything," he said. "Down deep, it owns nothing." Harriet had laughed because the mine seemed colder than death. Thomas shook his head. "Not the first 20 feet, that's still surface. But past the frost line, the ground steadies itself. 52 degrees near enough. January or July, doesn't care." He tapped the table with one finger. "The earth is slow. It drinks summer all year and spends it slowly in the dark. That's why the old prospect drifts keep cattle alive when a blizzard comes. Dry one, tight one, and a man can last longer in a hole than in a house." Harriet had listened because she loved his voice. She had not known she was being handed a key. Now Brisk was clawing at Cold Shoulder, and Thomas's sentence came back whole. "Dry one, tight one. A man can last longer in a hole than in a house." Harriet raised the pick. The first blows bounced. The hillside rang like iron. Her hands stung. Her shoulders burned. Brisk whined beside her, throwing dirt that did not move. She worked anyway. Not quickly, not bravely in the way stories like to make things brave. She worked because the alternative was to sit in House 7 and wait for a lock to turn. By noon, the pick broke through the frozen crust into loose gravel. By afternoon, her shovel struck wood. She cleared with her hands until her nails split and bled. There, 4 feet under the scree, was a squared timber gray with age but still solid. Beside it, another. Then a third. A sealed entrance, not natural. Made. The old miners had filled it with rock to keep children and drunks from wandering in, but the backfill was sloppy. Harriet pried stone after stone from the opening until the hill breathed on her face. The air that came out was not warm, not like a stove, but it was not winter air. It did not bite the lungs. It simply existed, steady and dry, as if the storm season belonged to another country. Harriet lit the lantern and crawled inside. The drift was low, just high enough for her to move bent over. Hand-cut marks scored the walls. Old timber sets stood every few yards. The floor was packed clay, dry enough to hold a footprint. 50 feet in, the passage widened into a little work chamber where some forgotten prospector had once kept tools, powder, or hope. Harriet stood there a long time. Then she took off one glove. She pressed her bare palm against the rock. It felt cool, but not dead, steady. The next morning she walked 9 miles to a free mercantile beyond company credit and spent almost everything she owned. 14 yards of wagon canvas, a coil of hemp rope, a box of tin washers, 2 brass hooks, a narrow length of stovepipe with a damper, lamp oil, beans, cornmeal, salt. The clerk offered to send a wagon. Harriet refused. She loaded the goods into a borrowed handcart and pulled them back herself, inch by inch, over the frozen road. By the time she reached Cold Shoulder, the sky had gone purple. Then the real work began. She made 2 canvas doors instead of 1, hanging them 6 feet apart to trap the air between. She wedged scrap boards into the entrance frame. She sealed cracks with clay and ash. She found a natural seam in the roof of the drift and fitted the stovepipe through it, packing the gaps with mud until smoke would rise out of the hill instead of filling the chamber. She moved her bedding first. Then Thomas's cup. Then the little iron stove. Then the mercury thermometer he had once brought home from the mine office after it cracked its wooden case. On the 9th of November, Harriet left House 7 empty. Klein's replacement could have the boards. She had found the part of Thomas the company had not known how to repossess. That night the first hard front came down. The temperature outside fell from 28 degrees to 2 below before midnight. Snow moved sideways through the gulch. Cabin walls popped with cold. Chimneys smoked badly. Windows frosted white from the inside. In the drift, Harriet sat on her bedroll with Brisk asleep against her boots. The stove held 3 short sticks of pine. The thermometer beside the timber post read 61 degrees. When the fire settled and the flame went low, it dropped to 53. No lower. Harriet opened the inner canvas, stepped into the air pocket, then opened the outer flap just enough to hold the thermometer outside. The wind tore at her sleeve. A minute later, she brought it back in, 18 below. Inside, behind canvas, clay, timber, and earth, 53. The difference was not luck, it was a law. Harriet sat in the lantern glow and put her hand to the wall again. Thomas had said the earth remembered summer, now that memory was holding her alive. For 3 weeks, Pine Cleft decided she was already half gone. Some thought she had fled to Missoula. Some said she was living like a coyote in the rocks. Ephraim Klein heard rumors of smoke from Cold Shoulder and rode up with 2 company men to see what kind of nuisance she had made. Harriet was cutting willow switches near the entrance when he arrived. He stared at the canvas flaps, the stovepipe, the neat stack of wood under an oilcloth. "What is this?" "My home," Harriet said. "This hill belongs to the company. The house did too. I left it." Klein's mouth tightened. "You were instructed to leave Pine Cleft." Harriet looked up at the ridge. "I did." He pushed past her and tore open the outer flap. Warm mineral air brushed his face. Beyond the second canvas he could see lantern light and the dull black curve of the stove. He did not understand it. That was what angered him most. A thing outside his ledger had no right to work. "You choose to live in a burrow," he said. "Then the company has no obligation to protect you." Harriet picked up another willow switch. "You never did." One of the men looked away. Klein mounted and turned his horse downhill. "Let the mountain take her," he said. But the mountain had already taken her in. The winter that followed became the kind old people name. The January blow began with a sound under the doors of every house in Pine Cleft, a low whistle that grew into a scream before dawn. Snow already packed the road. By noon, no road existed. By nightfall, every lamp in town looked like a star trapped inside a bottle. For 4 days, the world narrowed to white. The company bunkhouse stove glowed red and still could not warm the far wall. The store's canned peaches burst on the shelf. 2 mules froze in the stable after the roof beam cracked and dropped snow on their backs. A child in the lower cabins woke with blue lips. Men burned chair legs, fence rails, even the church's extra pews. The cold made every human arrangement look thin. Credit did not warm a room. A title did not stop wind. A manager's house did not bargain with ice. On the second night, Klein's own brick chimney choked with blown snow, sending smoke back through the parlor until his wife crawled coughing into the kitchen. On the third night, A roof leak froze inside the north wall, expanding until the plaster split with a sound like a gunshot. All over Pine Cleft, people discovered the same truth at different speeds. Their houses stood above the winter. Harriet stood inside something older. In the drift chamber, the storm arrived as a murmur. No roof groaned, no wall shuddered. Snow buried the entrance, and the buried entrance made the chamber quieter. Harriet burned wood only at dawn and dusk. Most of the day, the ground did the work. 52, 53, 51 when she left the flap open too long. 64 when the stove was fed. She melted snow. She made bean broth. She slept under one quilt, not three. Brisk lay with his nose toward the canvas as if guarding the edge of a different world. On the fourth morning, after the wind dropped into an exhausted moan, Harriet heard shouting, not close, not clear, human. She dug out through the entrance and stepped into a landscape so bright it hurt to see. A man was coming up the slope, falling more than walking. Behind him, a woman staggered with a bundled child in her arms. A boy of about 7 dragged a smaller girl by the mitten. It was Caleb Mercer, a carpenter from the lower row. His beard was white with frozen breath. One side of his face was waxy. He did not waste words. "Chimney burned through," he gasped. "Had to kill the fire. We have no heat." Harriet opened the canvas. Inside, the Mercers entered expecting a cave. They found a room, a low-timbered chamber lit by lantern and stove flame. Blankets on a plank platform, a kettle steaming. Dry boots lined against one wall. The smell of hot cornmeal, the impossible absence of wind. Mrs. Mercer began to shake so hard, Harriet had to hold the cup to her mouth. The children cried only after they were warm enough to feel how cold they had been. Harriet did not make a speech. She wrapped them, fed them, put Caleb's fingers in cool water first, then warmer water, because Thomas had taught her that frostbite punished impatience. Only when the family could breathe again did Caleb look at the wall. "How?" Harriet handed him the thermometer. Then she led him 15 feet deeper into the drift. "Hold it there." He watched the mercury settle. 52. "No fire back here," he whispered. "No," Harriet said, "just earth." She told him what Thomas had told her. Past the frost line, the ground stops following the weather above. Dry rock keeps a steady temperature. An old drift with tight doors can hold that steadiness. The stove is not the savior. The stove only adds comfort. The ground is the stove, Caleb said. Harriet nodded. And the door keeps it from spending itself. A carpenter understood at once. He saw the system. Not magic, not charity, a repeatable shelter. When the Mercers could travel, Caleb went back down the gulch with his family and told everyone who would listen that the widow on Cold Shoulder had not survived by luck. She had engineered the hill. By the end of the week, people came in 2s and 3s. A stable hand whose ears had gone black at the rims. A mother with a feverish baby. A miner carrying his father on a sled made from a door. Harriet let them warm themselves, and then she taught them what she knew. 2 barriers, not 1. Dry entrance, packed seams. Stove vented clean, chamber set back from wind, fire used sparingly, earth trusted constantly. Her shelter became the warmest room in Pine Cleft and the smallest school the town had ever had. Klein came last. He did not come as an official. He came with his wife on Caleb Mercer's sled. The manager's house had failed. The boarding house was overfilled. His wife's cough had turned wet and frightening. The man who had once told Harriet the mountain should take her now stood before her canvas door, with his hat in both hands. For one long moment, no one spoke. Harriet looked at Mrs. Klein first, then she stepped aside. "There is room by the stove." Klein's face moved as if he wanted to say something large and found nothing small enough to fit through his pride. Inside, Harriet gave his wife broth. She gave Klein a blanket. She did not ask for apology. She did not accuse him. She did not remind him of the ledger, the house, the word burrow, or the curse he had thrown over his shoulder. She simply treated him as a body in danger of cold, and that was worse than any speech. because the judgment in that room did not come from Harriet. It came from physics. The same winter that had obeyed no company order had brought the company man to the woman he had discarded. Spring arrived slowly. The snow pulled back from the gulch in dirty folds. Roofs reappeared. Fence lines rose from the drifts like drowned ribs. Pine Cleft began counting what it had lost, and more quietly, what it had learned. By April, 3 new earth shelters were already being dug into dry banks above town. By May, Caleb Mercer had drawn a plan for a timbered root room with double doors and a high vent. By June, the story had reached the district office through miners' letters, a preacher's report, and the testimony of families who had spent living nights inside Harriet's drift while company buildings cracked around them. Ephraim Klein was transferred before summer to a payroll desk in Helena. The company did not call it punishment. Companies rarely do. One afternoon, a surveyor rode to Cold Shoulder with a folded paper and an oilskin sleeve. He removed his hat before speaking to Harriet. "The Pine Cleft Mining Company," he said, in recognition of service rendered during the January emergency, granted Harriet Vale legal title to 5 acres surrounding the old drift. The land was not a gift. Not really. It was a surrender. A company that measured everything in ore, rent, and debt had been forced to admit that Harriet held the one asset it had overlooked. Useful truth. She signed with Thomas's pen. Her hand did not shake. Years passed, and the drift became less like a refuge and more like a home. Harriet replaced the canvas with double plank doors, packed with wool and sawdust. She lined the chamber in pine boards. She built a stone hearth around the little stove, then added a second room where potatoes, apples, medicine, and lamp oil kept through every season at the same patient temperature. In summer, children came to stand in the doorway and feel cool air spill out around their ankles. In winter, travelers followed the stovepipe smoke when storms pinned them in the gulch. People began calling deep, double-doored hillside shelters Vale rooms. Farmers built them into north banks. Miners cut them beside remote claims. A professor from Bozeman came with measuring tools and left astonished that a widowed miner's wife had turned common underground knowledge into a working frontier design. Harriet disliked praise. When asked how she had invented it, she always corrected the question. "I didn't invent it," she said. "The earth was doing it before any of us got cold." She kept dogs all her life. After Brisk came Moss, then Juniper, then a yellow old hound named Candle who slept so close to the stove he singed one ear and never learned from it. Harriet lived long enough to see Pine Cleft shrink after the ore thinned and the company wagons stopped coming. The bunkhouse emptied, the store closed, roofs sagged, men went where wages went. Families followed, but on Cold Shoulder, smoke still rose from the hill. On winter evenings, Harriet sometimes sat inside the open inner door with a shawl around her shoulders and Thomas's cup in her hands. She would look at the timber sets and the rock beyond them and speak to her husband as if he had only gone to another shift. "You were right," she would say. Not loudly. Not for anyone else. "You were right about the earth." Harriet Vale died in March of 1938. During a late storm that shut the pass for 2 days. She was found in her bed inside the hill, warm under a quilt, Brisk's old collar hanging from a nail near the stove. The town that had tried to evict her was mostly gone by then, but the room remained. In 1976, preservation workers mapping abandoned mining camps in the Bitterroots found a collapsed stovepipe on Cold Shoulder and began clearing the entrance below it. Local ranchers had told them the old story, though by then stories had become loose around the edges. They expected a cave. They found doors. Behind the rotted outer boards, the inner door still stood. The chamber beyond smelled faintly of pine, ash, and mineral dust. The hearth was intact. The plank walls had darkened but not failed. On a square nail beside a timber post hung Thomas Vale's cracked thermometer. One of the workers lifted it into his flashlight beam. Outside, August heat shimmered in the gulch. Inside the hill, after 85 years, the mercury read 53 degrees. The house was still working, not because a company had permitted it, not because a town had believed in it, but because one woman with $9, a loyal dog, and a sentence remembered at the edge of ruin had trusted a truth older than every deed in the valley. The winter had come for Harriet Vale, and the earth had answered first.